Your kid is hitting, kicking, screaming at you that you are the worst parent ever. Are they having a meltdown or is it a tantrum? And what's the difference? We're going to dive into exactly that in today's episode and why it matters. Or is it just semantics, right? Welcome back to Raised Resilient, where I help you end the meltdowns without punishments, bribes, or yelling. I'm Dr. Hillary Manzik, parenting coach, clinical psychologist, and mom of 3 kids who feel their feelings in big ways. I'm so glad you're here. So, tantrums versus meltdowns. When I first heard that they are not the same thing, I was kind of like, okay, are we really being that picky with our words? Like tantrum, meltdown, same thing. But they are not the same thing. They don't have the same root cause. And it's actually really important to how we respond to understand the difference. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown and how you're going to start to understand the difference, because they can look the exact same on the outside. Hitting, kicking, screaming, saying, I hate you, you're the worst, I want this thing, don't tell me no, I really want to do that. All the things. So how do you tell the difference and why does it matter? A meltdown is a complete emotional and often physical overload. So when I think about what a meltdown is, I like to think of it in terms of this metaphor that I call the emotional water pitcher. So you imagine that your child is carrying around a pitcher of water. And with every little stressor that happens during their day, a little bit of water gets poured into that pitcher, right? So a kid takes the line leader position when they really wanted to be first in line. A little bit of water gets poured into the pitcher. You ask them to pick up their toys and they didn't want to stop playing. A little bit of water gets poured into that pitcher. The teacher speaks harshly to another kid in the classroom, not even to them, but for sensitive kids, a little bit of water goes into that pitcher. And the more water that we pour into that pitcher, eventually the pitcher is going to overflow. Unless your child knows how to let little bits of water out of that pitcher, i.e. feeling their feelings throughout the day. But a lot of kids are going to naturally hold that water in the pitcher when they're not with you, because you're their safe person. You're the person they know is there to help them with those feelings. So if they're at school, if they're, at soccer practice, a lot of kids are going to hold that water in the pitcher until it feels safer to let it out. And honestly, we do this as adults too. Like you might get an upsetting email at work, but you're not going to necessarily start crying in the middle of the conference room. Maybe if it's upsetting enough, but a lot of times you're just going to file that away and it's going to load on your emotional water pitcher, right? So we all do this. This is a normal and healthy process. We learn where it's safe to share our feelings and where it's not. But what can happen, especially for sensitive kids, is that they get caught in a pattern of always trying to hold it in, even when they're around their safe people, because when they are having a meltdown, they're completely out of control. They can't stop themselves from doing all of these undesirable behaviors like hitting and kicking and saying horrible things. And they know that we don't want them to do that. And yet they also don't know how to stop themselves, which feels really unsafe and really uncomfortable. And so they just try to hold it in and hold it in and hold it in until they can't anymore. And that water comes pouring out of that pitcher in the form of a meltdown. So meltdowns are complete overload, overflow. And that's why the thing that sets the meltdown off is usually something pretty simple and small and seemingly insignificant. Like you aren't pushing them right on the swing, or, you gave them the snack that they asked for, but you didn't put it in the right bowl, right? And it seems like, oh my goodness, why are you falling apart over something so small and silly? Well, because that thing is just the straw that broke the camel's back, and out comes the water. And if you don't think your child is doing this, if you don't think your child is loading up that water throughout the day, I promise you they are. All kids do this. Some kids do it in a more pronounced way. And what fills a child's water pitcher is going to be unique to each child. There are some things that universally are going to load onto their stress system, but For some kids, sensory input loads onto that water pitcher, right? So especially, for example, neurodivergent kids and especially autistic kids, sensory input fills that water pitcher in addition to emotional input. So they might sort of hear sounds that other people can just tune out, and it loads onto that water pitcher. And so you might see a sensory meltdown that has nothing to do with anything that's happening in the room. They're just melting down seemingly out of nowhere, but it's because that sensory input, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights, the kid clicking their pencil in the desk next to them, the person coughing down the hall, right? These sensory inputs can load onto a child's water pitcher as well. So the thing that causes the meltdown isn't really the thing that causes the meltdown. And all kids are to some degree holding it together when they're not with their safe person, which is you. For example, my daughter recently told me at bedtime, she said, "Nobody loves me." And of course, I wanted to say, are you crazy? Like, everybody loves you. And they do. Everybody loves this kid. She is just charismatic. She has like the Riz, as the middle schoolers would say. Although my middle schooler tells me that's no longer cool. But I wanted to say, everybody loves you. What are you talking about? You know? And that's not what I said, because I know that's not helpful. I was able to kind of take a second and think, what does she need right now? And so I said, oh, that feels like a really hard way to feel. Tell me more. And she's like, well, today at preschool, I didn't want to stop playing. And the teacher said I had to stop playing. And so I did, but I didn't like that. Now, this was a significant thing to her because she was telling me this at bedtime. She had held on to it for literal hours. But what did the teachers see in that moment? Nothing, right? They saw a kid. They probably said, come on, get in line. And she said, okay. And she got in line like a non-event. But to her, that loaded heavily on her water pitcher. And then she told me, and then later at music class, I wasn't sitting crisscross. And the teacher asked me to sit crisscross. And I didn't like that. Again, what did the music teacher see? She probably said, hey, sit crisscross applesauce. And my daughter's like, okay. And she did. Again, non-event. If you ask the teacher, how's she doing at school? The teacher would say, she's doing great. She's following directions like a champ. But when she got home, she had held on to that all day long. And it came out at bedtime. And I would argue that a couple years ago, I wouldn't have known how to support that comment of nobody loves me. I would have probably said, oh, well, everybody loves you. What are you talking about, right? And so then she would have held it in even more. And we might have had a meltdown the next morning over gosh knows what, over nothing, over socks, over an outfit that she said she wanted to wear the night before, but then didn't the next morning, right? But she needed to let out water. She needed to share those emotions with me so that she didn't start the next day with her pitcher already full from the day before. Now, I was a sensitive kid growing up, and I can still remember where I was in moments where adults misunderstood me, spoke harshly to me, just generally didn't understand me or meet my needs. And I wonder for some of you listening if you can relate to that. Maybe you can think back to when you were in second grade and the teacher told you to get in line and you thought you were in line and now you're feeling all the feelings, right? This is what happens for our sensitive kids. And so that pitcher just loads and loads and loads. And if they don't have those safe outlets that thankfully my daughter had that night, that pitcher will just keep filling to the top and coming out in a meltdown. And again, if your child is stuck in a pattern of suppressing those emotions on purpose because those emotions get them into trouble, at least that's how they think of it, right? They associate the feeling with the behaviors that come with the feeling. And they know that every time I feel this way, it overwhelms everybody around me and gets me into trouble, and I don't want that. So they hold those emotions in until they can't anymore, which only leads to bigger, stronger, more frequent meltdowns over time. And hence the meltdown cycle. So that's a meltdown. Now, what's happening during a tantrum is a little bit different, even though it can look exactly the same on the outside. So tantrums are developmentally appropriate and happen for all kids, usually around starting somewhere between 1 and 2, starting during that toddlerhood, right? And just to be so clear, toddlerhood starts at 12 months or when they're walking. I think there's a little bit of play around when it starts. And then lasts until they turn 3. So 1 to 3 roughly is toddlerhood. When they turn 3, they are now preschoolers from 3 to 5, right? And so at some point during toddlerhood, kids undergo a developmental shift to where they start to understand themselves as separate from their caregivers. So up until that point, your baby, if you have a baby right now, your baby kind of thinks that the two of you are one, right? Your baby does not understand that you are a whole separate person. But at some point, as your baby becomes a toddler, they start to understand that, like, I am me and you are you. And I have my brain and you have your brain, and I want this, but you might not want that. And I can want something different than you. I mean, that's amazing when you think about that, right? So a tantrum is actually a massive developmental milestone, which I know might feel wild to hear. So when your toddler is like, no, that's actually a really good thing, because your toddler is expressing that, like, hey, I'm separate from you and I'm going to say that I want something different. I'm not just going to be cool with whatever you decide, right? And this is why we can hear things like the terrible twos. But if you understand how toddlers are experiencing the world, you know how to meet these moments. And I love toddlerhood. That is one of my favorite developmental phases. And I always found it so enjoyable because I understand it and because I know how to support these tantrums. So when your child is having a tantrum and they're saying, no, I don't want, really what they need in that moment is to be validated and experienced as a separate person, to have their separateness sort of celebrated in that moment. So here's what that might sound like. You're telling me, no, you don't want to put your shoes on right now. I hear you. I get that, right? That doesn't mean that they don't have to put their shoes on. And a lot of times with a tantrum, when you just sort of acknowledge the feeling behind it, a lot of times they'll move on because that's all they needed. There's another kind of tantrum that I've heard referred to as a prediction error. And I want to remember, I think it was Mona Delhook that initially called it that. But this prediction error essentially is your toddler's brain trying to predict what's coming, because think about being a toddler, everything is brand new, right? Everything. And so for your toddler, when you hand them a banana and they expected, because the last banana that you gave them was cut up, they're expecting it to be cut, but you didn't cut it this time, or vice versa. Last time you gave it to them whole because maybe they were a baby and they were just learning to eat it, and this time you decided, I'm going to cut it up. But their brain kind of glitches for a second. It's like record scratch, like, wait, what? And the tantrum looks like they wanted the banana to be whole instead of cut, but actually it's not about that at all. It's that they were expecting the banana to be a certain way. And so sometimes we might try to say, oh, you really wanted me to not cut the banana. I get that. And then they're still upset because we're not really acknowledging what's actually happening. So in that case, the more helpful acknowledgement might be, you were expecting the banana to be whole because that's what it was like last time, weren't you? And so this is where this whole idea of, like, just validate the feeling, just acknowledge the feeling. This is where that largely comes from, because in the case of a tantrum, that's super helpful. Your toddler's like, yes, that is how I feel. And this is not to say that only toddlers have tantrums, but that's where they start. And that's why they start. And so as children grow, there are still tantrums. Tantrums are essentially, I don't like this outcome. I really wanted that thing. Okay, like, I really want dessert and you're telling me I can't have it. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes not being given the dessert that they wanted is also the thing, the last straw that sets off the meltdown. And this is where this can get tricky. But sometimes it really is just that they really wanted that dessert. And the goal in that case is to hold space for that disappointment so that your child gets better at experiencing disappointment in your safe presence. That's a good thing. You want to raise a child who's comfortable experiencing disappointment. And that's actually the antidote to entitlement. People ask me all the time, I'm worried I'm raising an entitled kid because I'm letting them feel all these feelings. Entitlement comes from never letting them feel disappointed. Okay, fine, here's the cookie. Just don't cry. That's where entitlement comes from. When we actually let them feel disappointed, I know you really, really want dessert tonight. I hear you. That's letting them feel the disappointment while not giving them the cookie. And that's building a muscle. It's just like going to the gym. We're building that muscle of feeling disappointed. So with a meltdown, you can try to say those same things. And if you're not sure which one you're dealing with, sure, try it. But if you say, oh man, I can see that you really wanted dessert, and your child is just flailing on the floor, especially if you know that they've just been at school all day and they've held it together and they've held it together. Now they're coming home and falling apart over seemingly nothing. Maybe we're dealing with something that is a little bit deeper than that surface level, I just wanted it to be different tantrum. And again, that's not to say that a tantrum isn't valid or important. It is. And in the ways that I just described, it's really important for development. But a meltdown is a complete overload and loss of emotional control. And once your child is in meltdown mode, a lot of times words are not helpful. That's not to say that they never are, but a lot of times your child can't process your words at that point. Their logical reasoning brain is offline and they are just in their feelings. And so you might try to process emotions or make validating statements and your child hears you like the teacher from Charlie Brown. Wah, 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 wah. It's just noise. And their nervous system is just overloaded and that noise only makes it worse. So once your child is in that meltdown mode, you've got two jobs. And that is to keep everybody safe and to welcome the emotions. That's it. Knowing that your child is in that full-on meltdown mode is really important, because when you understand what's happening for a child in meltdown mode, you start to understand why punishments, rewards, bribes, empty threats, like none of that works. Your child is, kind of long gone at that point. We got to let the meltdown play out. And counterintuitively, the more we try to stop the meltdown, avoid the meltdown, the more we're perpetuating the meltdown cycle because we're not letting our kid pour the water out of that pitcher. So in a nutshell, that's the difference between tantrums and meltdowns. And understanding that difference, again, you're not going to perfectly be able to identify in the moment because they do look the same a lot of the times. You're not going to be able to perfectly always identify this is a tantrum versus this is a meltdown. This is where attuning to your child in that moment, attuning to your specific child, because what works for my child in these moments might not help your child. So we have to learn the skill of attunement, which means reading their cues and responding, and then shifting our response if whatever we did wasn't helpful. That's the work. And that's where, you might respond initially as if it's a tantrum, and you might very quickly figure out we are in full-on meltdown mode. That's okay. That's part of the work. That's the messiness of it. But understanding that there is a difference is going to guide you in responding more effectively over time. And if this is something that you need help with, if you are stuck in a pattern of daily meltdowns that are getting worse and not better, and you want to know how to break out of that meltdown cycle in 8 weeks or less, that's exactly the work that we do with parents. I want to invite you to click the link in the show notes and book a free breakthrough call where we'll talk about what's going on, see if this is something we can help you with. And if it is, we will let you know exactly what that looks like. So I hope it's been helpful to understand the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown. Again, the more you understand, the better attuned you can be in these moments. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you in the next episode.